Hey guys, before we start, if you're the kind of person who likes drifting off to old, half-forgotten history, go ahead and hit subscribe. It helps this channel more than you'd think. And if you want, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're listening from tonight. No rush. Just something nice to see in the morning. All right, get comfortable. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Pull the blanket up. Let your eyes soften. Tonight we're going somewhere cold, somewhere dark, somewhere far out on open water, where wood creaked under starlight and men slept inches from the sea that could kill them. This is the story of what it was really like to sleep aboard a Viking ship. In the dead of winter, picture the North Atlantic in January. Not calm. Not blue. A slate-gray heave of water stretching in every direction, no coastline in sight, no lights, no shelter, just a long wooden hull rising and falling with the swell, and inside it, a crew of men trying to survive the night. There was no cabin. No warm bunk below deck. A Viking longship was open to the sky, its deck exposed to wind, spray, and the bitter cold that settled into bone and stayed there. When these ships sailed in winter, and some did, despite the danger, the men aboard faced a kind of exhaustion that modern travel rarely demands of anyone. Cold that never left. Wet wool that never dried. Sleep that came in scraps, stolen between watches, snatched wherever a body could fit, and yet they went. Winter after winter, some crews pushed out past the safety of the shore season, past the months when sailing was expected, into the weeks when the sea itself seemed to be daring them to try. Why would anyone choose this? That question sits at the center of everything we're about to explore tonight. Because to understand Viking seafaring, you have to first understand that the ship was never just a vessel. It was a shelter, a workplace, a battlefield, and a bedroom, all folded into the same 40 or 60 feet of oak and pine. There was no separation between the dangers of the voyage and the intimacy of daily life. Men ate where they navigated. They slept where they rowed. They dreamed, if they dreamed at all, with salt water in their hair and the sound of the hull groaning beneath them. Consider, for a moment, what a single winter night actually involved. The temperature dropping as the sun vanished by mid-afternoon. The wind picking up, carrying with it a cold that cut straight through wool cloaks and sealskin boots. The ship's timbers flexing with every wave, a low, constant creaking that never fully stopped, not for a moment, not for the whole voyage. And somewhere in that darkness, men lying down, not in beds, but in whatever gap they could find between cargo, sea chests, and the shoulders of the men beside them. There was no privacy. No true rest. Sleep, if it came, arrived in fragments, always with one ear listening for a shift in the wind, a shout from the steersman, the particular sound a wave makes just before it breaks over the side. We tend to imagine the Vikings through their raids, their longships cutting toward unsuspecting shores, their reputation as warriors and traders who reshaped the map of medieval Europe. But that image skips over something quieter, and in some ways, more remarkable, the sheer physical endurance required simply to survive the journey itself. Long before a single sword was drawn, before any coastline came into view, these men had already fought a battle against cold, exhaustion, and the sea's own indifference. Tonight, we're going to sit inside that battle. Not the dramatic parts, not the raids, not the sagas told around later fires, but the quiet, grinding reality of what it meant to close your eyes on a wooden ship in the middle of winter. Not knowing whether you'd wake to a clear morning, or to water pouring over the gunwale in the dark, we'll look at how these ships were built to survive conditions that seem, by any modern measure, nearly impossible to endure. We'll follow the crew through their roles, their rest, their quiet suffering, and the strange comfort they found in each other despite it all. For now, just let yourself settle into that image, a longship, low in black water, sailing on through a winter night that shows no sign of ending. The wind hadn't changed, but the story does now, pulling back from that dark, rolling deck to ask a quieter question. How was a vessel like this even built to survive such a thing? Because the longship wasn't born from nothing. It was born from generations of trial, failure, and slow correction, shaped by men who understood, better than most anyone before them, exactly what the North Atlantic demanded of a hull. Start with the wood itself. Norse shipbuilders favored oak for the keel and the main structural planks, chosen not for its beauty but for its stubbornness, its refusal to crack under pressure. Oak resists splitting along its grain, which mattered enormously when a ship needed to flex without breaking apart in heavy seas. And flex it did. Unlike later ships built with rigid frames, a Viking longship was constructed to bend, to twist slightly with each wave, distributing the strain across its entire length rather than letting it concentrate in one weak point. This wasn't guesswork. Shipwrights split the oak along its natural grain rather than sawing it, producing planks that kept the wood's inherent strength intact. Each plank, called a strake, overlapped the one below it in a method known as clinker building, fastened with iron rivets and sealed with wool soaked in pine tar. Picture that for a moment: wool, the same material that kept a man's body warm, doubling as the seal that kept the ocean out. Nothing on this ship existed for a single purpose. Everything did double duty, because weight, space, and time were luxuries no one could afford. The keel ran the length of the hull like a spine, cut from a single towering oak when possible, since a keel built from multiple joined pieces introduced weak points that the sea would find, eventually, without fail. Shipbuilders selected trees with almost superstitious care, looking for oaks that had grown slowly, in poor soil, producing dense, tight-grained wood far stronger than fast-growing timber from richer ground. Now shift from the wood to the sail, because a longship without wind was just a very well-built rowboat. Norse sails were woven from wool, not linen or cotton like many other cultures preferred, and this choice mattered more than it might seem. Wool sails were heavier. Yes, but they held their shape better in the punishing gusts of northern waters, and crucially, they resisted the kind of stretching and sagging that would have made steering nearly impossible in a storm. Weavers coated these sails with a mixture of fat and ochre, both to waterproof the wool and to give it that distinctive reddish hue you may have seen in reconstructions, a color that wasn't decoration, but function, born from necessity. Consider the labor this required. A single sail could take a small group of women an entire year to weave, working wool that had first been sheared, cleaned, spun, and dyed before a single thread touched the loom. The ship's survival, in a very real sense, depended on work done far from the water, by hands that never set foot on the vessel itself. Below the waterline, the hull was shallow by design, allowing these ships to sail not just across open ocean but up rivers, into fjords, onto beaches where deeper-hulled vessels could never follow. This shallow draft came with a cost, though a lower profile meant less protection from waves breaking over the sides, which meant the crew stayed wetter, colder, and more exposed than sailors on almost any other ship of the era. And then there was the question of storage. Where do you put dry clothing, food, tools, weapons, and sleeping furs on a vessel with no below-deck compartments, no cabins, nothing but an open hull from bow to stern? The answer, mostly, was you didn't have a good answer. Sea chests doubled as rowing benches. Furs and supplies were lashed down wherever space allowed, covered against spray that came anyway, seeping in through gaps no amount of wool and tar could fully seal. This was a vessel built with extraordinary skill and understanding of wood, water, and wind, and still, by its very design, offered almost nothing in the way of comfort. The same choices that made it fast, flexible, and capable of crossing open ocean also made it merciless toward the men who called it home for weeks at a time. They built a ship that could survive winter. Whether the same could be said for the men aboard it, that's a different question entirely, and one this story isn't finished asking. The ship sits ready now, hull sealed, sail woven, oak flexing with a strength earned through generations of careful choice. But a ship built to survive winter still needed a reason to face it. And that reason turns out to be more complicated, more human, than most people expect, because sailing in winter wasn't the Norse default. Far from it. The vast majority of Viking voyages happened during the sailing season proper, roughly from early spring through late autumn, when daylight stretched long and the worst of the storms hadn't yet arrived. Winter sailing was the exception, rare, dangerous, and undertaken only when something made the risk worth it. So what made it worth it? Trade, for one. Norse merchants understood something that modern shipping still grapples with: certain goods lost value the longer they waited. Furs trapped in autumn needed to reach southern markets before their quality degraded. Walrus ivory, prized across Europe for carving crucifixes and game pieces, moved fastest along routes that didn't always cooperate with a merchant's calendar. If a ship missed the last safe window of autumn, a captain faced a choice: wait out the entire winter in a foreign port, losing months of potential trade, or risk the crossing and arrive while demand, and prices, remained high. There's something almost familiar in that calculation, isn't there? The tension between safety and opportunity hasn't changed all that much in 1,000 years. Then there was the matter of politics, which rarely paused for weather. A chieftain summoned to a winter assembly, a marriage alliance requiring a timely arrival, a message that couldn't wait for spring. These pressures existed regardless of what the sea was doing. Norse society ran on obligation and reputation, and a man who failed to appear when expected, who let ice and wind become his excuse, risked something harder to repair than frostbite. He's standing. His word, necessity, played its part too, though less romantically than the sagas suggest. Sometimes a ship simply found itself caught out. A voyage that began in the safety of late autumn could stretch longer than planned, delayed by unfavorable winds. By a detour to trade or gather supplies, by the slow accumulation of small setbacks that left a crew facing winter seas not by choice, but by circumstance. In these cases, there was no decision to make. Turning back might mean sailing directly into the storm they were trying to avoid. Pressing forward, however grim, sometimes offered better odds, and then, quieter than trade or politics, there was something harder to name. A kind of restlessness particular to certain men, a refusal to let the calendar dictate the shape of a life. Norse sagas, written centuries later but drawing on older oral traditions, occasionally hint at voyages undertaken almost out of stubbornness, captains who pushed past the safe season because staying felt worse than the risk of leaving. Whether pride, ambition, or something closer to restlessness, the sea offered a kind of freedom that solid ground, tied to farms and obligations, couldn't match. Consider what this meant practically. A crew preparing for a winter crossing didn't simply hope for good luck. They loaded extra wool, extra dried fish, extra rope, knowing that any delay caused by weather could stretch a 2-week voyage into 5 or 6. They studied the sky with an attentiveness that modern sailors, armed with satellite forecasts, rarely need to summon. They watched the color of clouds at dusk, the behavior of seabirds, the particular smell that seemed, to experienced sailors, to precede a shift in wind. None of this eliminated the danger. It simply meant the danger was, at least, anticipated rather than blundered into blindly, so when a longship pushed away from shore in the grey light of a winter morning, it carried more than cargo and crew. It carried a decision, weighed carefully against real alternatives, made by men who understood exactly what they were risking and chose, for reasons of trade or duty or something less easily explained, to risk it anyway. The sea ahead didn't care about their reasons. It never has. But understanding why they went, that's the first step toward understanding what came next, once the shore disappeared behind them and there was nothing left to do but endure. They made their choice, and the shore fell away behind them. Now the ship becomes its own small world, and inside that world, every man aboard has a place, a role that determines not just his work, but his chances of surviving what's coming. A longship crew wasn't a random gathering of bodies. It was a structure, deliberate and precise, built around the demands of the vessel itself. At the top sat the skipper, sometimes the ship's owner, sometimes a captain chosen for experience rather than wealth. His authority wasn't ceremonial. On a winter crossing, a wrong decision about wind, timing, or course could end the voyage for everyone aboard, and the crew understood this with a clarity that didn't require explanation. Below him, the steersman held perhaps the most demanding position of all. Positioned at the stern, gripping a single oar mounted to one side rather than a centered rudder, this man read the sea continuously, adjusting for swells, current, and the ship's own shifting balance. In daylight, this was difficult work. In darkness, in winter, with spray freezing against his hands and eyelashes, it became something closer to endurance testing itself against skill, hour after hour, with no relief in sight until the next man took his place, and relief, here, meant something specific. Watch rotations. We'll examine those more closely soon, but for now, understand this: every role aboard had its shift. Its window of active duty, followed by a window meant for rest. Meant for it, though rest itself proved elusive, oarsmen made up the bulk of the crew, and their work varied enormously depending on wind. Under full sail, with good weather, oars sat idle, lashed along the sides. But wind rarely cooperated for an entire voyage, and when it failed, or blew from the wrong direction, or vanished into an eerie flat calm, the oars came out, and men pulled, sometimes for hours, muscles burning against cold that should have numbed the pain but somehow never quite did. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from rowing in freezing air. The body generates heat, sweat forms beneath layers of wool, and then the moment the rowing stops, that same sweat turns cold against the skin, pulling warmth away faster than if the man had never worked at all. Experienced sailors understood this danger, understood that stopping too quickly after hard labor could be as dangerous as the labor itself, and so even rest had to be managed carefully, deliberately, never simply collapsed into. Beyond the skipper, steersman, and oarsman, smaller roles filled out the crew. A man responsible for provisions, tracking dried fish and hard bread and the precious, dwindling supply of fresh water. Someone skilled with rope and sail repair, essential when winter winds tore at canvas that summer crossings rarely tested so harshly. And often, though not always, a man whose experience with weather and stars made him something like a navigator, though the term suggests more formal training than Norse sailors typically possessed. Theirs was knowledge built from repetition, from years of watching how a particular cloud formation preceded a particular kind of wind, knowledge passed down through observation rather than written charts. Rank aboard ship didn't always mirror rank on land. A skilled oarsman with years of sea experience might command more practical respect than a wealthier man new to sailing, because the sea, unlike society, cared nothing for inherited status. It cared whether you knew how to read a wave before it broke, whether your hands remembered rope work even when numb with cold, whether you could stay useful after 18 hours without proper sleep. This mattered enormously for how a crew slept, or tried to. Rest wasn't distributed equally. Higher status men sometimes claimed slightly better positions, marginally more shelter from wind, a few extra furs. But the difference was smaller than you might expect. Because the ship offered so little comfort to begin with that even the best position aboard remained, by any reasonable standard, miserable. What united every man aboard, regardless of rank, was this: none of them slept a full night. Not really. Not in the way sleep is meant to work, uninterrupted, restorative, safe. Instead, sleep became something snatched, negotiated, fought for in brief windows between duties, and it's to that particular struggle, the actual mechanics of where and how these men rested, that we'll turn next. So where, exactly, did a man lie down on a ship with no cabins, no bunks, no walls to separate him from the wind? This question sounds simple. The answer, once you understand it, explains almost everything about why winter voyages tested endurance in ways few modern experiences can match. The honest answer is, wherever there was space. And on a longship, space was the scarcest resource aboard, rationed more carefully than food or water. Picture the layout. Down the center of the ship ran a walkway, narrow, used for moving between the mast and the steering position. On either side, rowing benches stretched toward the hull, each one wide enough for a man to sit, or in hand, during active rowing. When rowing wasn't required, these same benches became something else entirely, the closest thing to a bed most of the crew would find. A man might lie along a bench, knees drawn up because the space rarely accommodated a full stretch, back pressed against the curve of the hull, using whatever he could find as a pillow. A rolled cloak. A leather bag. Sometimes nothing at all, just an arm folded beneath his head, cheek against damp wool. This wasn't comfortable sleep. It wasn't meant to be. It was survival sleep, the kind the body takes when given no better option, brief and shallow and easily broken by cold or noise or the shift of the ship beneath him. Some crews carried what were called sea chests. Wooden boxes used for storing personal belongings, and these did double duty as makeshift furniture. A man might sit on one during the day, then curl partially around it at night, using its solid shape as a windbreak, something between his body and the worst of the spray coming over the side. It wasn't much. But on a night when the temperature dropped well below freezing, even a small barrier against wind made a measurable difference. The most sheltered position, when available, sat near the mast, where the ship's structure offered slightly more protection from wind coming broadside. This spot was contested, quietly, without open argument but with clear understanding of who claimed it and why. Experience mattered here. A man who'd survived previous winter crossings knew, instinctively, which few feet of deck offered the best chance at an uninterrupted hour or two of rest, and newer crew members learned quickly, through cold nights and hard lessons, to defer, for truly exposed voyages, particularly rough winter crossings. Some ships carried a large piece of oiled leather or heavy waxed cloth, sometimes referred to in later sources as a type of tent covering. though calling it a tent overstates its comfort considerably. This covering could be stretched across part of the ship, offering minimal shelter from direct rain or snow, though wind still found its way beneath every edge. Setting it up took effort, and on a ship already short on hands and time, this covering wasn't always used, reserved instead for moments when the crew judged the weather severe enough to justify the trouble. Furs mattered more than almost anything else aboard. Sealskin, wolf pelt, sheepskin, whatever a man could bring, he brought, because these were his only real defense against the specific cold of open water in winter. Wool alone, even good wool, eventually grows damp with sea spray and loses much of its insulating power. Fur, particularly sealskin treated to resist water, held warmth longer, and men guarded their furs with the same seriousness they guarded weapons. Sleep, when it came, rarely lasted more than a few hours at a stretch, and even those hours were shallow, easily broken. The ship never stopped moving. It never stopped making noise. A man might close his eyes to the groan of timber and the hiss of water along the hull, and wake, minutes or hours later, to the same sounds, unchanged, as if no time had passed at all. What we're describing here isn't rest in any familiar sense. It's closer to a kind of managed exhaustion, a body forced to recover just enough to keep functioning, never enough to feel whole. And this raises a question worth sitting with as we move forward. How does a person's mind adjust to a place with no true rest, night after night, week after week? That adjustment, that quiet reshaping of what the body and mind come to accept as normal, is where we're headed next. That question of adaptation lingers, but before the mind can adjust to anything, the body has to survive first. And surviving, on a winter longship, came down to a fight fought almost entirely through fabric and fur, waged constantly, without pause, against a cold that seemed to have a will of its own. Understand something about cold at sea, it isn't the same as cold on land. Wind carries moisture, and moisture pulls heat from the body at a rate dry cold never approaches. A Viking sailor standing on an exposed deck, spray coating his clothing, faced a version of cold that could kill within hours if his layers failed him, even in temperatures that might seem survivable by inland standards. Wool formed the foundation of nearly everything worn aboard, and this wasn't accident or tradition alone. Wool possesses a peculiar property that made it, until relatively recent synthetic fabrics, nearly unmatched for cold weather survival. It retains a meaningful portion of its insulating capacity even when wet. Cotton, by contrast, becomes nearly useless once soaked, drawing heat away from the body far faster than no clothing at all. Norse sailors likely didn't understand the science behind this. They understood the result, learned through generations of hard experience, of men who trusted the wrong fabric and paid for it with fingers, toes, sometimes their lives. Layering mattered as much as material. A sailor typically wore an underlayer of finer wool against the skin, followed by a heavier outer garment, sometimes felted for additional density and wind resistance. Over this, when conditions demanded it, came fur, and here, choice of animal mattered enormously. Sealskin resisted water better than nearly any other material available, its natural oils shedding moisture rather than absorbing it. Wolf and bear pelts offered dense insulation but soaked through more readily, useful for warmth around a fire, less reliable against direct sea spray. Hands presented a particular problem, one that never fully resolved no matter how careful the preparation. Rope work, sail adjustment, rowing, in nearly every task aboard required dexterity that thick fur mitten simply couldn't provide. Sailors often worked bare-handed or with thin wool gloves in conditions that, by any modern safety standard, would demand immediate shelter. Frostbite crept in through this gap in protection, starting as numbness, progressing toward a dangerous, false warmth that experienced sailors learned to recognize as a warning rather than relief. There's a particular horror in that detail worth sitting with quietly. The moment frostbite stops hurting isn't the moment it's getting better. It's often the moment it's getting worse, nerve damage advancing past the point of pain into something more dangerous. Sailors who'd witnessed this before knew to watch a crewmate's hands for a shift from red to white to a waxy, unfeeling gray, and knew, too, that the remedy, slow re-warming, never direct heat, never rubbing, required patience that exhausted, frightened men didn't always have. Feet suffered similarly, trapped in leather boots that, however well made, couldn't fully resist standing water that pooled along the ship's bottom despite constant bailing. Wet feet in freezing air represented one of the most common and dangerous conditions aboard, one that could render a man unable to walk, let alone work, within a single bad night. Beyond clothing, sailors relied on movement itself as a defense. Standing still in cold wind invited disaster in a way that even light activity helped prevent. Rowing, when required, generated genuine warmth, though this created its own dangerous cycle. You work up a sweat, then stop, and that same moisture became a liability the moment exertion ended. Experienced crew members learned to manage this carefully, shedding a layer before hard rowing, adding it back immediately after, never allowing sweat to sit against skin any longer than necessary. Food played its part too, though we'll examine provisions more closely soon. For now, understand that eating wasn't simply about hunger. Fat and protein fueled the body's own internal heating system, and sailors who ate poorly found themselves colder, faster, than those who managed to keep some reserve of energy available for the body to burn against the cold. None of this made the cold survivable in any comfortable sense. It simply made it survivable, period, which was the only standard that mattered out on open water in January. Every choice, every layer, every small adjustment existed for one purpose alone: to buy a few more hours before the body's defenses finally gave out, and defenses, even carefully managed ones, eventually needed rest. Which brings us back to sleep, and to a detail we've only touched on so far: the strange, disciplined rhythm of watch rotations that determined, with brutal precision, exactly when that rest was allowed to come. That rhythm we mentioned, the discipline governing when rest was allowed, deserves its own careful look now, because it reveals something essential about how a crew survived weeks at sea without ever truly stopping. A longship never slept. Not entirely. Not even for a moment. This was a fundamental reality of ocean travel that Norse sailors understood with total clarity. The sea didn't pause for exhaustion, didn't wait politely while a crew rested. Wind shifted at any hour. Currents pulled at any hour. A storm building on the horizon gave no warning tied to daylight or convenience. Someone, always, had to be watching. This necessity produced the watch system, a structured rotation dividing the crew into groups, each taking turns at active duty while others attempted whatever rest the ship allowed. The specifics varied by crew size and captain's preference, but the underlying logic remained consistent across most Norse vessels: divide the night and day into segments, assign responsibility for each segment to a portion of the crew, and never, under any circumstances, leave the ship entirely unwatched. Consider what this meant for a man's actual experience of time aboard. A sailor might stand watch for several hours, eyes straining against darkness, tracking the horizon for changes in wave pattern or cloud that signaled shifting weather. When his watch ended, he didn't simply lie down and drift into deep, restorative sleep. His body remained braced, alert in a way that resisted true rest, because he knew, with absolute certainty, that his next watch would arrive within hours, not days. This created something we might call fragmented sleep architecture, though the sailors themselves would never have used such language. They simply knew it as exhaustion, layered and cumulative, never fully resolved by the brief windows of rest between duties. Modern understanding of sleep cycles tells us something these sailors intuited without the vocabulary to name it. True restorative sleep requires uninterrupted stretches, allowing the body to pass through its natural stages fully. A watch system, by its very design, prevented this. Men aboard winter crossings likely existed for weeks in a state of accumulated sleep debt, a condition modern research associates with impaired judgment. Slower reaction times, and a kind of emotional flatness that dulls even fear itself, and yet, somehow, they functioned. They had to. The steersman's watch demanded perhaps the most sustained attention, given the critical nature of his role, and captains often rotated this position more frequently than others, recognizing that fatigue here carried consequences far beyond a single man's discomfort. A drowsy steersman, however briefly inattentive, could steer a ship broadside into a wave capable of swamping the deck, endangering every soul aboard. Lookout duty, positioned near the bow, required a different kind of vigilance, scanning darkness for the darker shape of an approaching wave. For ice that might have drifted into open water, for any change in the sea's texture that experienced eyes learned to read like a language. This watch depended heavily on individual skill, and crews valued sailors who developed what amounted to an instinct for reading water in near-total darkness, a sense that couldn't easily be taught, only earned through years of exposure. Between watches, men attempted what rest they could, understanding, without needing to discuss it, that this rest existed on borrowed time. A sailor might close his eyes knowing he had perhaps 3 hours before a hand on his shoulder called him back to duty, and this knowledge itself, this constant awareness of an approaching interruption, shaped the quality of whatever sleep managed to arrive. Shallow. Watchful, even in unconsciousness. The kind of sleep that leaves a person more tired upon waking than they were before closing their eyes. There's a particular quiet observation worth making here. The human body, remarkably, does eventually adapt to almost anything, given enough repetition. Sailors on extended winter voyages likely developed a capacity for functioning on fragmented rest that would seem extraordinary by ordinary standards, not because the exhaustion disappeared, but because their baseline for normal shifted, gradually, without any single dramatic moment marking the change. This adaptation had limits, though, and those limits pressed closer with every passing day at sea. The ship's constant motion, the ever-present sound of water and wind, the cold that never fully receded even during rest, together, these formed a kind of sensory environment unlike almost anything experienced on land, one that shaped not just how these men slept, but how their minds processed the experience of never truly escaping it. And it's that particular sensory reality, the sound and motion that surrounded every waking and sleeping moment alike, that we'll turn toward next. Close your eyes for a moment, the way those sailors tried to, and imagine what actually surrounded them, hour after hour, whether awake or attempting sleep. Because before we go further into the physical dangers of this voyage, it's worth sitting inside the sensory world these men inhabited, a world defined less by sight, since darkness swallowed most of it, and more by sound, and motion, and the particular way a body learns to exist inside constant, unrelenting movement. The ship never sat still. Not for a second, not even in the calmest conditions. Water moves constantly, and a vessel resting on that water moves with it, a perpetual, rolling motion that never fully paused even when wind dropped and waves flattened. For a man aboard weeks at a time, this motion became a kind of baseline reality, something the body eventually stopped registering as movement at all, simply because it never stopped long enough to be noticed as separate from stillness. But in winter, calm was rare. More often, the ship pitched and rolled through genuine swell, rising with each wave, sliding down the far side, rising again, a rhythm that never quite repeated itself exactly, never became predictable enough for the body to fully relax into. This irregularity mattered. Predictable motion, humans adapt to reasonably well. Irregular motion, the kind that keeps some small part of the inner ear perpetually recalibrating, taxes the body in ways that accumulate over days and weeks, contributing to a low-grade physical stress that never fully resolved. Then there was sound, layered and constant, forming a kind of auditory environment unlike almost anything experienced on land. The hull itself creaked continuously, wood flexing against wood, a sound Norse sailors would have learned to interpret with real precision, a certain pitch meaning normal stress, a different pitch, sharper, meaning something worth investigating. This wasn't background noise to be tuned out. It was information, constantly monitored, even by men attempting to sleep. Beneath the creaking ran the sound of water itself, endlessly varied depending on conditions. In calmer seas, a steady hiss along the hull, almost soothing in its consistency. In rougher water, something closer to a low roar, punctuated by the sharper crack of a wave breaking against the bow, spray following a half-second later, cold and sudden even on men who'd felt it 100 times before. Wind added its own layer, moaning through rigging, snapping at the edges of the sail when it caught wrong, a sound that shifted constantly with direction and strength, never settling into anything a sleeping mind could simply filter out and ignore. And beneath all of this, quieter but always present, the small sounds of the crew itself. Someone shifting position on a hard bench. A muffled cough, quickly suppressed. The soft scrape of a boot against wood as a man rose for his watch. On a ship this small, with this little privacy, every sound belonged to everyone, an intimate, unavoidable closeness that must have shaped the crew's relationships as much as any shared meal or shared danger. Consider what this meant for actual sleep. Modern sleep science tells us that consistent, ambient noise can sometimes aid rest, while irregular, unpredictable sound disrupts it, keeping the brain in a state of low-level vigilance even during unconsciousness. A Viking sailor's sleeping environment offered almost none of the consistency that might have helped, and nearly all of the unpredictability that worked against it. Every creak might be ordinary. Every creak might also be the first sign of something wrong. The sleeping mind couldn't always tell the difference, and so it stayed, in some small way, always listening. There's something worth noticing in how the body eventually responds to this kind of environment. Given enough repetition, sailors likely developed a peculiar skill, an ability to sleep despite the noise and motion, while somehow remaining capable of waking instantly at specific sounds that mattered. A shift in the wind's pitch. A shout from the watch. The particular groan of wood under stress rather than ordinary strain. This wasn't full rest, not by any generous definition, but it represented an extraordinary adaptation, a mind learning to filter constant sensory input into background and foreground, threat and non-threat, even while technically unconscious. This adaptation came at a cost, though, one that accumulated slowly across the length of a voyage, and it's a cost we'll examine more directly in the chapters ahead. For now, simply sit with this image, men lying in darkness, surrounded by sound that never fully stopped, motion that never fully settled, learning, out of pure necessity, to call this something close enough to rest. That constant listening, that low hum of vigilance even in sleep, existed alongside another reality these men couldn't escape, one written directly onto their hands, their fingers, the very tools they depended on to keep the ship moving at all. Rope, aboard a Viking longship, wasn't a minor detail. It was the nervous system of the entire vessel, controlling the sail, securing cargo, lashing down anything that might otherwise slide loose in heavy seas. And rope, in winter, became something almost unrecognizable from its summer self, stiff, unyielding, coated in a thin glaze of ice that turned simple tasks into small ordeals repeated dozens of times a day. Consider what happens to hemp or wool rope when repeatedly soaked in freezing seawater. Ice forms not just on the surface but works into the fibers themselves, and the rope that once bent easily around a cleat or through a hand now resists, stiff as a branch, unwilling to coil into the smooth loops a sailor's muscle memory expected. Adjusting the sail, a task that took moments in fair weather, could stretch into a prolonged struggle against frozen cordage that seemed determined to fight back, and this struggle happened, almost always, with bare or barely covered hands. We touched earlier on the impossibility of thick gloves for detailed work, but it's worth sitting inside this specific moment more fully. A man's fingers, already numbed by hours of cold, gripping ice-stiffened rope, trying to coax movement from fibers that seemed to have frozen into permanent rigidity. The skin on his palms and fingertips, repeatedly exposed to this combination of cold and abrasion, cracked easily, small fissures that stung sharply in salt air, slow to heal in an environment offering no real chance for recovery. There's a particular danger hidden in this repeated exposure, one experienced sailors understood instinctively even without medical vocabulary to describe it. Frostbite doesn't announce itself dramatically. It begins as a deep ache, then tingling, then, more dangerously, numbness that some men mistook for their hands simply toughening against the cold. This numbness was the actual warning sign, the moment when tissue damage moved from reversible to something far more serious, and sailors who ignored it, who kept working past that threshold out of necessity or simple exhaustion-driven carelessness, risked losing fingers entirely, a devastating injury for men whose livelihood depended almost entirely on manual skill. Crews developed small mitigations, born from hard experience rather than any formal training. Working in pairs when possible. So one man's hands could rest briefly while another took over a task, even for a few minutes. Tucking hands beneath opposite armpits between tasks, using the body's own core warmth to slow the progression of numbness. Chewing on strips of dried fish or fat, not just for nutrition but because the simple act of working the jaw seemed, anecdotally, to help maintain circulation and alertness during long stretches of cold exposure. None of this fully solved the problem. It simply slowed its progression, bought time, the same currency every survival strategy aboard this ship seemed to trade in. The mast itself demanded particular caution. Climbing it, when sail adjustments required reaching height, meant gripping a wooden pole coated in the same treacherous ice affecting the rigging, while the ship's constant roll threatened to fling an unwary sailor off entirely. This task fell typically to younger, more agile crew members, though agility offered only partial protection against fingers too numb to maintain a secure grip. Consider, too, the ropes controlling the ship's anchor when anchoring became necessary near unfamiliar coastline. Wet rope under tension, hauled by cold stiffened hands, created friction burns even through calluses built from years of similar work, small wounds that, in this environment, rarely had the chance to heal cleanly before facing fresh abuse the following day. By the voyage's later stretches, most crew members carried some visible mark of this ongoing battle: split knuckles, blackened fingertips at the earliest, most survivable stage of frostbite, palms roughened beyond what even hardened sailors considered normal. These weren't wounds discussed openly, weren't treated as remarkable. They were simply the expected cost of the work, absorbed silently, tended to as time and resources allowed, rarely enough to fully heal before the next demand arrived. This silent endurance, this quiet acceptance of ongoing physical damage as simply the price of the voyage, reveals something about the mindset required to survive weeks at sea in winter. And it's a mindset that would be tested even further by dangers less predictable than cold and rope. Dangers that arrived without warning from the sky and the sea, both dangers we'll turn to now as we consider what these men ate, and how even something as basic as a meal became its own small act of survival against the winter around them. Every one of those small wounds, every hour of cold endurance, demanded something in return: fuel. And on a longship in winter, feeding a crew became its own quiet discipline, shaped as much by necessity as by the limits of what could survive weeks at sea without spoiling. Fresh food simply didn't last. There was no way to keep it cold in any useful sense, since the surrounding air did that job whether anyone wanted it to or not, but preservation against decay required different methods entirely, developed and refined over generations of seafaring experience. Dried fish formed the backbone of most provisions, particularly cod, which Norse communities had perfected the art of preserving through simple air drying in the cold. Dry winds of Scandinavian coastlines. This process, requiring no salt, produced a hard, almost wood-like product that could last months without spoiling, a critical advantage for voyages of uncertain length. Eating this dried fish required its own small ritual. Too hard to simply bite into, sailors often softened pieces by chewing slowly, working saliva into the tough fibers, or occasionally soaking a portion in seawater when fresh water ran short, accepting the added salt as a reasonable trade for softened, more digestible food. The taste, by most accounts, leaned intensely savory, almost overwhelming in its concentrated fishiness, a flavor that modern palates might find difficult but that provided essential protein when little else was available. Alongside dried fish came hard bread, sometimes closer to a dense cracker than anything resembling a modern loaf, baked specifically to resist moisture and mold during long storage. This bread, too, demanded patience to eat, often requiring softening in whatever liquid was available, whether that meant precious fresh water or, when supplies ran low, simply saliva and persistence. Butter, when available, offered something the crew's bodies desperately needed: concentrated fat, essential for maintaining body heat in conditions that burned calories at a rate summer voyages never approached. Norse sailors understood, even without modern nutritional science, that fatty food seemed to help against the cold in ways that lean protein alone didn't quite match. Butter could be preserved for surprisingly long periods when properly stored, sometimes buried in peat bogs before a voyage began, a practice that also, incidentally, gave it a distinctive flavor some sailors apparently came to prefer. Skyr, a thick, fermented dairy product similar to yogurt, provided another source of preserved nutrition, its fermentation process naturally extending its usable life well beyond what fresh milk could offer. Combined with dried fish and hard bread, it formed a diet that, while monotonous, provided enough protein and fat to sustain hard physical labor in brutal conditions. Fresh water presented perhaps the most persistent challenge of all. Barrels or skins carried aboard held only so much, and rationing became a constant, unspoken calculation every sailor understood without needing reminder. Rain, when it fell as actual rain rather than freezing into ice or snow, offered a chance at replenishment, sailors sometimes catching what they could in whatever containers were available. Though this remained an unreliable supplement rather than a dependable source, meals themselves happened without ceremony, without the kind of shared, unhurried eating that might occur on land. A sailor might eat during a lull in rowing, tearing off a piece of dried fish with cold stiffened fingers, chewing mechanically while scanning the horizon out of habit rather than active duty. There was little conversation over these meals, little of the social warmth food often carries in other contexts. Eating was function, fuel intake, a task completed efficiently before returning attention to whatever the ship demanded next. And yet, within this stark practicality, small moments of genuine comfort occasionally surfaced. A particularly good piece of dried fish, softer than expected, might draw a quiet nod of appreciation between crewmates. A sip of something slightly sweet, perhaps mead carried for special occasions or simply morale, could momentarily lift a crew's collective mood in ways disproportionate to the small pleasure itself. These moments mattered more than their size suggested, small anchors of normalcy in an environment otherwise defined by relentless hardship. Food, in the end, functioned as one more tool in the constant battle against the winter sea, not a source of pleasure in any conventional sense, but a necessary input keeping bodies functioning, minds alert enough to manage the countless small decisions a voyage like this demanded every single hour. And as we turn next toward the dangers of fire aboard ship, we'll see how even the promise of warmth, something as fundamental as heat itself, remained frustratingly, dangerously out of reach for most of this journey. That promise of warmth we mentioned, the thing every cold body instinctively reaches for, existed on this ship almost entirely as absence. Because fire, the most basic human comfort against cold, was something a Viking longship could rarely offer, and understanding why reveals just how thoroughly this voyage stripped away even the smallest mercies. Wood, wind, and open flame make a combination no sailor in his right mind wants aboard a vessel built almost entirely from the first two. A longship's hull, mast, and deck were all constructed from carefully seasoned timber, dry enough to be workable, dry enough, unfortunately, to burn with terrifying speed if flame ever escaped control. Add constant wind, gusting unpredictably across an open deck, and any spark carried real risk of becoming something no crew could contain, hundreds of miles from any shore that might offer escape. This risk meant that open cooking fires, common on land, were essentially impossible during active winter voyages. A crew couldn't simply build a small hearth on deck the way they might at a winter camp, couldn't risk the wind catching an ember and carrying it towards sail or rigging. The math here was brutal in its simplicity. A fire aboard ship, however small, however carefully tended, represented a danger potentially greater than the cold itself. This left crews dependent almost entirely on cold provisions, the dried fish and hard bread we discussed, food requiring no preparation beyond patience and strong teeth. There was no hot meal waiting after a difficult watch, no warm broth to ease bodies that had spent hours fighting frozen rope and biting wind. This absence, small as it might sound compared to the larger dangers of the voyage, likely wore on morale in ways that compounded the physical hardship already present. When conditions allowed, and they rarely did during active winter sailing, some crews carried a small portable hearth, essentially a stone or clay container that could hold coals separately from the ship's wooden structure, offering minimal, carefully controlled heat. Even this required near-perfect conditions, calm seas, minimal wind, and constant, vigilant attention from whoever tended it. A single unexpected swell, tipping coals from their container, could turn a moment of comfort into genuine catastrophe within seconds. More commonly, any real fire, any actual hot food or genuine warmth, waited until landfall, until a crew reached shore and could build the kind of fire that open water simply didn't permit. This created a psychological rhythm worth noting. Voyages became bookended by warmth, memory of the last fire before departure and anticipation of the next fire after arrival, with the entire stretch between defined by its absence. Sailors likely thought about fire more during these crossings than almost any other single comfort, precisely because its absence was so constant, so total. There's something worth considering here about how deprivation shapes perception. A small fire, modest by any land-based standard, likely felt during these voyages like genuine luxury, remembered with a clarity that better, more elaborate comforts rarely earn. The human mind, it seems, calibrates pleasure against absence as much as against objective quality, and few absences aboard this ship were as total, as constantly felt, as the lack of flame and warmth. Some evidence suggests certain crews took calculated risks during particularly severe cold, judging the danger of hypothermia to outweigh the danger of fire, especially once a ship found brief shelter in a cove or inlet offering some protection from open wind. These moments, when they occurred, must have carried a strange mixture of relief and continued tension, crew members simultaneously grateful for warmth and acutely aware of how quickly that same warmth could turn dangerous if left unwatched even briefly. For the most part, though, fire remained theoretical during active winter crossings, a comfort discussed perhaps, remembered certainly, but rarely actually available. This absence forced sailors to rely entirely on the layered defenses we've already discussed: wool, fur, movement, food, and simple endurance, because the one tool humans have relied on for warmth since our earliest history simply wasn't safe to use out here, on wood and water. Surrounded by wind that never fully stopped, and it's that same wind, when it grew from steady nuisance into genuine threat, that brings us to perhaps the most feared danger of the entire voyage: the storms that could arrive in darkness, testing every ounce of skill and endurance a crew had left. Every sailor aboard carried this fear somewhere close to the surface, even during calm stretches, even during hours when the sea behaved itself and the wind stayed manageable. Because storms in winter didn't announce themselves with the courtesy of daylight. They arrived, often, in darkness, and darkness is where this particular danger did its worst work. Consider the specific horror of this combination: a Viking longship, low-hulled and open to the sky, caught in genuine storm conditions, with visibility reduced to nearly nothing beyond the faint grey shapes of waves the crew could sense more than see. Modern sailors, even now, regard storms as serious threats. For a ship with no engine, no modern weather forecasting, no radio to call for help, a night storm represented something closer to a direct confrontation with forces entirely beyond human control. The first sign, often, wasn't visual at all. Experienced sailors described a change in the wind sound before anything else shifted, a rising pitch, a new urgency to how it moved through rigging that had, until that moment, made a fairly steady, predictable noise. This auditory warning gave a crew perhaps minutes, sometimes less, to prepare for what was coming. Preparation meant specific, practiced actions, executed by men whose hands, despite cold and exhaustion, had performed these motions enough times to work almost independently of conscious thought. Reducing sail became the immediate priority, since a full sail caught by sudden, violent wind could capsize a ship in seconds, snapping the mast or simply overwhelming the hull's ability to remain upright. Sailors reefed the sail smaller, sometimes lowering it entirely, working against rope that fought back with the same icy stubbornness we discussed earlier, except now under pressure that allowed no margin for the usual careful patience, once storm conditions fully arrived, the ship's survival depended almost entirely on the steersman's skill. And this role, difficult even in calm seas, transformed into something extraordinarily demanding. Waves in a storm didn't simply rock the ship gently. They rose into genuine walls of black water, and a steersman's task became reading these waves in near-total darkness, angling the ship's bow to meet them rather than allow a wave to strike broadside, which risked rolling the vessel entirely. This required a kind of sensory awareness that's difficult to fully convey. Unable to see clearly, the steersman relied on feel, the specific way the deck tilted beneath his feet, the sound of a wave building before it broke, an almost instinctive sense of timing built from years of exposure to conditions just short of this severity. A single misjudgment, a wave taken at the wrong angle, could swamp the ship, filling the open hull with freezing water faster than any bailing effort could manage. And bailing, during a storm, became a desperate, continuous task for whoever wasn't otherwise occupied. Water that came over the sides needed removing constantly, using whatever containers were available, buckets or simply cupped hands when nothing else remained, because a ship taking on water faster than it could be removed faced a slow, terrifying arithmetic that ended, eventually, in the hull sitting too low, too heavy, too vulnerable to the next wave. Fear, in these moments, wasn't something crew members discussed openly. There was no time, no breath to spare for words beyond the essential commands needed to coordinate survival. But fear was there, unmistakably, present in the tightness of gripped rope, in eyes that stayed wide despite exhaustion, in the particular silence that fell over men too focused on immediate survival to process anything beyond the next wave, the next gust, the next few seconds that needed surviving before any longer stretch of time could matter. Some storms passed relatively quickly, violent but brief, leaving a shaken crew to slowly return to normal watch rotations, adrenaline fading into a bone-deep exhaustion that made the following hours feel almost dreamlike. Others stretched longer, testing endurance in ways that blurred the line between physical danger and simple, grinding fatigue, crew members pushing past what they might have believed possible, because the alternative, stopping, giving in to exhaustion mid-storm, simply wasn't survivable. When a storm finally broke, when wind eased and the worst of the wave action settled into something more manageable, the relief that followed carried a particular weight. Quiet and profound. Rarely expressed in words but felt clearly in the way exhausted men finally allowed themselves to sit, to breathe fully, to acknowledge, if only internally, how close that particular night had come to ending very differently. This fear, this ever-present awareness of what the sea could do without warning, shaped everything about how these voyages were experienced, and it connects directly to something quieter but equally dangerous: the slow accumulation of exhaustion and illness that storms like this left in their wake, a toll we'll examine closely as we continue. That relief after a storm never lasted long, because the body keeps its own accounting, separate from whatever the sea decides to do next. And on a winter voyage, this accounting came due gradually, quietly, in a form far less dramatic than storms but, in its own way, just as dangerous. Exhaustion aboard a longship wasn't simple tiredness. It was cumulative, compounding across days and weeks of fragmented sleep, cold exposure, and physical labor that never fully paused. The body, pushed this consistently without adequate recovery, begins to fail in ways that aren't always visible at first, small deficits accumulating beneath the surface until they suddenly, sometimes dangerously, become impossible to ignore. Consider what this looked like practically. A sailor's reaction time, sharp during the voyage's early days, gradually slowed, not dramatically, but enough that small mistakes, a fumbled knot, a slightly delayed response to a shifting wave, became more common as weeks passed. Judgment, too, suffered in ways men aboard likely couldn't fully recognize in themselves, since exhaustion has a particular way of convincing the exhausted mind that its impaired decisions are perfectly reasonable. This mattered enormously in an environment where every decision carried real consequence. A steersman making a slightly delayed correction, an oarsman losing rhythm at a critical moment, a lookout whose attention drifted for just a few seconds too long, these weren't hypothetical risks. They were the accumulated cost of weeks without adequate rest, manifesting in small, dangerous ways throughout the voyage's later stages. Illness compounded this exhaustion, and the conditions aboard practically guaranteed some crew members would fall sick before the voyage ended. Constant dampness, inadequate warmth, close quarters with little separation between crew members, this environment favored respiratory illness particularly. Coughs that started mild and worsened without any real treatment available beyond time and whatever limited rest a sick man could steal between duties. A sailor falling ill aboard ship faced a particular kind of isolation, even surrounded by crewmates. There was no separate space to recover in, no true rest available even for someone genuinely unwell. He continued his duties as best he could, because the ship's small crew meant every set of hands mattered, and genuine incapacitation, however sympathetically regarded by crewmates, represented a real burden the remaining crew had to absorb. This created a quiet, unspoken pressure to endure rather than acknowledge weakness fully, a cultural expectation reinforced by the practical reality that acknowledging illness changed almost nothing about the demands facing the ship. A sick man still needed to eat, still needed to find what rest he could, still, when his watch arrived, needed to stand and perform his duty as best his weakened body allowed. Seasickness, too, affected even experienced sailors during particularly rough conditions, though hardened crew members likely developed some resistance through repeated exposure over years of sailing. For less experienced men, though, or during storms severe enough to challenge even seasoned stomachs, this added yet another layer of physical misery to bodies already strained by cold and exhaustion. There's a particular quality to suffering endured silently, without complaint, simply because complaint changes nothing about the circumstances. Norse culture, from what we understand through sagas and surviving accounts, valued a kind of stoic endurance, a reluctance to voice hardship that might have been partly cultural expectation and partly simple practicality. Since dwelling on suffering aboard a ship offering no remedy served little purpose beyond making the suffering feel heavier, this doesn't mean these men felt nothing, experienced no genuine distress beneath their composed exteriors. It means, likely, that whatever fear, pain, or despair arose during these weeks existed mostly internally, processed privately, rarely given voice beyond perhaps a quiet word to a trusted crewmate during a shared watch, in the particular intimacy that develops between men facing identical hardship together. By the voyage's later weeks, a crew that began the journey relatively fresh, relatively strong, had likely transformed into something quite different, bodies depleted, minds fogged with accumulated exhaustion, held together by discipline, routine, and whatever reserves of will each man carried into this voyage in the first place. This slow depletion, this gradual erosion of physical and mental reserves, represents perhaps the least visible but most universal danger these sailors faced, more constant than any single storm, more certain than any individual mishap, and it's within this depleted, exhausted state that something else began to take shape, not just physical suffering, but a particular psychological experience unique to prolonged exposure to cold, isolation, and unrelenting hardship. That inner experience, the way the mind itself adapted, or struggled to adapt, to weeks of endless winter sea, is where we'll turn our attention next. Beneath every physical hardship we've traced so far, something else was happening, quieter, harder to see, but perhaps just as significant to how these men experienced their weeks at sea. The mind, like the body, doesn't simply endure prolonged cold and isolation unchanged. It adapts, sometimes in ways that helped, sometimes in ways that likely troubled these sailors more than they ever admitted, even to themselves. Consider first the sheer monotony of the sensory environment. Gray water, gray sky, the same creaking hull, the same faces, day after day, with little visual or experimental variation to mark the passage of time beyond the changing angle of pale winter light. Human minds, research tells us now, rely partly on novelty and variation to maintain a clear sense of time's passage. Strip that variation away, replace it with repetition stretching across weeks, and something curious happens. Time itself begins to feel distorted, days blurring together until a sailor might genuinely struggle to recall how long he'd actually been at sea. This distortion likely served a strange, unintended purpose. A mind unable to clearly track the passage of grinding, difficult time may have been somewhat protected from the full psychological weight of confronting just how long the hardship had lasted, and how much further it might still stretch. There's a mercy hidden in that confusion, even if it wasn't consciously recognized as such by the men experiencing it. Isolation, too, shaped the mind in particular ways, though this wasn't isolation in the sense of being alone. Quite the opposite, these men lived in near constant physical proximity to their crewmates, rarely more than a few feet from another human being for weeks at a stretch. But isolation from the wider world, from family, from any input beyond the ship and the sea and the same handful of companions, created its own particular psychological pressure, a narrowing of experience that likely made the ship itself feel, after enough time, like the entire world rather than simply a temporary vessel moving through it. Cold itself, sustained and unrelenting, appears to affect mood and cognition in ways separate from its purely physical toll. Modern research into cold exposure suggests links to altered emotional processing, a kind of flattening of effect that may have served as a protective mechanism, dulling the sharper edges of fear or despair that constant danger might otherwise provoke. Sailors enduring week after week of genuine physical suffering likely experienced something similar, an emotional numbness that wasn't quite peace, but wasn't quite suffering either, a strange middle state that allowed continued function despite circumstances that, viewed clearly, might otherwise have been overwhelming. There's also the particular psychological weight of constant, low-level threat, distinct from the acute fear of a storm's peak intensity. Living for weeks with the knowledge that danger could arrive at any moment, from any direction, without warning, creates a specific kind of chronic stress response, one that doesn't spike and fade the way fear during a single dramatic event does, but instead settles into something more sustained, more woven into the basic experience of every waking and sleeping hour. And yet, within this difficult psychological landscape, something else seems to have emerged too, something worth sitting with quietly before we move forward. Shared hardship, endured together, appears to forge a particular kind of bond between people, one that modern psychology recognizes in contexts ranging from military service to disaster survival. Men who might have been relative strangers before departure likely found themselves, by the voyage's later weeks, bound together by something deeper than simple familiarity, a trust built entirely on having witnessed each other's exhaustion, fear, and quiet endurance, stripped of the usual social performances that ease and comfort tend to encourage. This particular closeness, this bond forged specifically through shared difficulty rather than shared comfort, deserves careful attention in its own right, because it represents perhaps the single unexpected gift these brutal winter voyages offered the men who survived them. And it's to that quiet, often unspoken connection between crewmates, the way suffering shared became something almost like belonging, that we'll turn our attention next. That bond, quiet and unspoken, carried these men through weeks that might otherwise have broken them individually. And eventually, if fortune and skill held together, a different kind of moment arrived, the first sight of land, rising grey and uncertain from a horizon that had offered nothing but water for what felt, by then, like an impossibly long stretch of time. Landfall didn't mean immediate relief. It meant, instead, a new set of decisions, often made by exhausted men whose judgment, as we've discussed, had been worn thin by weeks of accumulated fatigue. Foreign shores in winter offered no guarantee of welcome, no certainty of safety simply because solid ground had finally appeared beneath the keel. The first task, always, involved reading the coastline itself, searching for a landing spot that offered some protection from open wind, ideally a cove or inlet where the ship could be beached or anchored without immediate exposure to the sea's continued threat. Experienced sailors developed a practiced eye for this, recognizing subtle signs, a particular curve of shoreline, the way waves broke differently near submerged rocks versus open sand, that indicated safer versus more dangerous approaches. Once a suitable spot was found, beaching the ship itself required careful coordination, timing the approach to avoid running the hull against unseen rocks, using whatever remaining strength the crew possessed to guide the vessel into position without damage. That might prove impossible to repair in unfamiliar territory. This process, straightforward in calm summer conditions, became considerably more fraught when executed by men whose hands, after weeks of cold exposure, no longer responded with their usual precision. Then came the immediate, practical question of shelter, and this varied enormously depending on where exactly a crew found itself. Some voyages followed established routes, arriving at destinations where Norse settlements or trading posts already existed, offering genuine shelter, warm fires, and the company of others who understood, without needing explanation, exactly what kind of voyage these arriving sailors had just survived. Other landfalls offered nothing so accommodating. A crew forced ashore by weather or necessity, arriving somewhere unfamiliar, faced the immediate task of creating shelter from nothing, using whatever materials the landscape provided, combined with whatever supplies remained aboard ship. This might mean improvised structures built from driftwood and sailcloth, offering minimal protection but representing, after weeks at sea, an almost unimaginable improvement simply by virtue of not moving, not being constantly exposed to spray and open wind. Consider the particular sensation of standing on solid ground after weeks aboard a ship that never stopped shifting beneath a sailor's feet. Many crew members likely experienced something like sea legs in reverse, a persistent, disorienting sense that the ground itself was moving, an adjustment that could take hours or even days to fully resolve. This wasn't merely uncomfortable. It represented one more small hurdle, one more way the body needed time and stability to recalibrate after weeks of unrelenting motion. Fire, finally, became possible again, and this moment likely carried enormous significance beyond its practical value. After weeks without genuine warmth, without hot food, the simple act of building a proper fire, watching flames take hold, feeling heat radiate outward in a way the body had almost forgotten was possible, must have felt like something bordering on miraculous, even to hardened sailors who understood fire as an ordinary, unremarkable part of life on land. Food, too, took on new dimension upon landfall, particularly if local resources allowed for something beyond dried fish and hard bread. Fresh meat, if hunting or trade provided it, or simply the chance to prepare food properly. Heated and softened rather than gnawed cold and stiff, represented a genuine, significant improvement in daily experience, one that likely lifted crew morale considerably even amid the ongoing uncertainties of being in unfamiliar territory. But landfall also brought new risks, distinct from the dangers of open water. Unfamiliar coastlines might harbor unfriendly inhabitants, competing traders, or simply unknown hazards that required a different kind of caution than sailors had developed for reading wind and wave. The relief of solid ground came paired, always, with the uncertainty of not fully knowing what that ground might hold. This tension, relief mixed with continued vigilance, shaped how crews approached their time ashore, and it's this particular challenge, the task of establishing genuine, functional shelter in unfamiliar winter territory, that deserves closer examination as we continue exploring what these voyages actually demanded from the men who undertook them. That fire on the beach, that first taste of warmth after weeks of cold, represented only the beginning of what landfall actually required. Because a crew stranded or resting on foreign shores in winter needed more than a single evening's comfort. They needed shelter capable of sustaining them for however long circumstances demanded, and building that shelter became its own particular test of skill and resourcefulness. The specifics varied enormously depending on location, available materials, and how long a crew expected to remain ashore. A brief stop for rest and resupply required far less than a genuine winter camp, established when weather or damage forced a longer stay than anyone aboard had originally planned. For shorter stops, simple lean-to structures often sufficed, built quickly from whatever timber the landscape offered, combined with sailcloth or hide stretched across a basic frame to block wind and provide minimal protection from snow or rain. These structures prioritized speed of construction over comfort, understood by everyone involved as temporary, functional, nothing more than a brief improvement over the ship's open deck. Longer stays demanded something more substantial, and here Norse building knowledge, developed over generations of settling in harsh northern climates, proved invaluable even far from home territory. Turf, when available, offered excellent insulation, and crews with sufficient time might construct low, sturdy structures using turf blocks stacked over a simple wooden frame, creating shelter that could genuinely rival, in terms of warmth retention, more permanent buildings back home. Consider the labor this required from men already exhausted by weeks at sea. Cutting turf, hauling timber, constructing walls sturdy enough to withstand winter wind. This work demanded real physical effort from bodies that had spent weeks depleting their reserves rather than building them. Yet this labor likely felt different, psychologically, from the constant, grinding endurance required aboard ship. This was purposeful, visible progress, each hour of work producing tangible shelter that would directly improve their circumstances, a kind of labor that offers its own particular satisfaction even when physically demanding. Fire management within these temporary camps required careful thought. Balancing the need for warmth against the very real risk of campfires spreading uncontrolled, particularly in structures built partly from dried materials. Crews typically positioned hearths carefully, often near entrances or in specifically designated areas, allowing smoke to escape while containing flame within reasonable boundaries. Food gathering, too, became a priority once basic shelter existed. Depending on location and season, this might mean hunting whatever local game the terrain offered, fishing in nearby waters if conditions allowed, or trading with local inhabitants when peaceful contact proved possible. Norse sailors carried trade goods specifically for situations like this. Understanding that unexpected winter landfall might require negotiating for supplies rather than simply taking what circumstances demanded. Sleep, within these camps, offered genuine improvement over the ship's constant motion and exposure, though comfort remained relative. Men slept closer together than they might have chosen under better circumstances, sharing body heat within confined shelter space, wrapped in whatever furs and wool remained after weeks of hard use. This proximity, uncomfortable in ordinary circumstances, likely felt like genuine luxury compared to the isolated, exposed rest attempted aboard ship. There's something worth noting about how quickly the human body and mind adapt to improved circumstances, even modest improvement. A simple turf shelter, offering nothing resembling true comfort by any generous standard, likely felt to these sailors like genuine sanctuary after weeks of open water exposure. This recalibration of expectation, this capacity to find real relief in circumstances that would seem harsh by ordinary standards, reveals something important about human resilience, about the mind's remarkable ability to adjust its baseline for comfort based on recent, difficult experience. These temporary camps, however basic, however hastily constructed, likely represented some of the most genuinely restorative periods of the entire voyage, moments where bodies could begin actual recovery, rather than simply managed endurance. And this recovery mattered enormously, not just for physical health, but for the particular kind of resilience these men would need to draw on again, whether facing continued voyage ahead or eventually, the return journey home. This time ashore, this brief window of relative safety and improved rest, also offered something else worth examining closely, a chance for the bonds formed during shared hardship to deepen further, away from the constant demands of active sailing, in circumstances that allowed, finally, for something closer to genuine connection between men who'd survived so much together already. Away from the ship's constant demands, in the relative stillness of a winter camp, something that had been building quietly across weeks of shared hardship finally had room to surface more fully. Because survival like this, endured together rather than alone, tends to forge connections between people that ordinary circumstances rarely produce with the same depth or speed. Think back to who these men were before departure. A crew assembled for a voyage wasn't necessarily a group of close friends or even long-time acquaintances. Some crew members likely knew each other well, perhaps through family or years of prior voyages together. Others may have joined for this particular crossing alone. Strangers bound together by nothing more than a shared destination and a captain's need for capable hands. Weeks at sea changed this considerably. There's a particular kind of intimacy that develops when people witness each other at their most depleted, their most vulnerable, stripped of the usual social performances that ease and normalcy tend to encourage. A man who has watched a crewmate's hands shake with cold, who has shared his own fear during a storm's worst moments without needing to voice it, who has silently passed along a portion of his own limited food to someone struggling more than himself, this man knows his crewmates in a way that ordinary friendship, built through pleasant circumstances, rarely achieves with comparable speed. Consider the small, wordless exchanges that likely accumulated across the voyage's length. A hand briefly gripping a shoulder during an exhausting watch, communicating solidarity without needing explanation. A slightly larger portion of food quietly offered to someone visibly weakened, given without comment because comment wasn't necessary. The simple, sustained presence of another person nearby during the worst hours of cold and fear, offering nothing tangible but somehow making the hardship marginally more bearable simply through shared proximity. This kind of bond, formed through mutual witnessing of vulnerability, tends to create a particular quality of trust, one that modern psychology recognizes as distinct from friendship built through shared enjoyment or common interest. It's trust rooted in demonstrated reliability under genuine pressure, in having seen someone's true character emerge when circumstances stripped away every comfortable pretense. A man who performed his duties faithfully despite exhaustion, who shared rather than hoarded when supplies ran thin, who maintained his composure during genuine danger. This man earned a particular kind of respect from crewmates who understood, intimately, exactly what that composure had cost him. Within the temporary camp, away from active sailing duties, this bond likely found new expression. Evenings around a shared fire, something the ship itself had rarely permitted, offered space for the kind of quiet conversation that constant vigilance at sea had made nearly impossible. Men who'd spent weeks in close physical proximity but limited genuine interaction, exhaustion leaving little energy for anything beyond essential communication, now found themselves with unexpected space to simply exist together without immediate crisis demanding their full attention. These conversations, when they happened, likely ranged widely, though perhaps circling back repeatedly to the voyage itself, a kind of collective processing of what they'd endured together. There's real psychological value in this kind of shared narrative building, in survivors of difficult experience finding language, together, for what they've been through. It helps integrate difficult memory, transforms raw, unprocessed hardship into something closer to shared story, something that can be carried forward with somewhat less weight than it held in the moment itself. Hierarchy, too, likely softened somewhat during this time ashore, though never disappearing entirely. The particular respect earned through demonstrated competence and reliability during the voyage's hardest moments carried weight that outlasted the return to camp, shaping how crew members related to each other in ways that pure social status, back on land, might not have predicted. This bond, forged through shared suffering and tested repeatedly across weeks of genuine hardship, represents something these men likely carried forward long after this particular voyage ended, a connection that shaped future working relationships, future voyages, perhaps even friendships that lasted lifetimes. And it stands as a quiet testament to something important about human resilience, that even the harshest circumstances, endured together rather than alone, can produce something genuinely valuable, a closeness that comfort and ease rarely manage to create with comparable depth. But this hard-won camp, this brief window of relative safety, couldn't last indefinitely. Eventually, whether by necessity or plan, these men would need to face the water again, and it's to those moments, the closest calls, the nights when survival itself hung genuinely in the balance, that we'll turn our attention next. Every bond, every quiet campfire, every hour of hard-won rest existed against a backdrop these men never fully escaped, not really, not even ashore. Because somewhere in every crew's memory sat at least one night, sometimes more, when survival itself had come down to something closer to chance than skill, a night none of them spoke about easily, even among themselves. These weren't the storms we've already examined, dangerous but at least somewhat anticipated, somewhat prepared for through the crew's collective experience and practiced response. These were the moments when something unexpected, something beyond even a well-drilled crew's ability to fully manage, pushed the entire voyage to the edge of catastrophe. Consider one particular kind of near disaster, documented in various forms across surviving accounts and sagas, a sudden, unexpected shift in wind direction, arriving without the usual warning signs experienced sailors had learned to read. A ship running under sail, suddenly caught broadside by wind from an unanticipated direction, faced immediate, severe risk of capsizing, the entire vessel tilting dangerously as sail and hull fought forces they weren't positioned to handle. In moments like this, survival depended on speed of response measured in seconds rather than minutes. A skipper's immediate, correct command, a crew's ability to execute that command despite exhaustion and cold-stiffened bodies, the sheer luck of the wind not shifting further before corrective action took hold, all of this needed to align correctly, and when it did, when a ship narrowly avoided capsizing through some combination of skill and fortune, the crew's collective relief likely bordered on something approaching disbelief. Ice presented another particular danger, one requiring constant vigilance even when other conditions seemed manageable. Drift ice, sometimes invisible until nearly upon it in darkness or fog, could tear open a hull with sufficient force, and lookouts bore particular responsibility for spotting the telltale signs, a certain darker patch against dark water, an unusual pattern in how waves broke, that might indicate ice ahead. A near miss with drift ice, a moment when a ship narrowly avoided collision through last-second course correction, likely left crews shaken for hours afterward, adrenaline slow to fade even once immediate danger passed. Then there were the mechanical failures, dangers arising not from weather or ice but from the ship itself, however carefully built and maintained. A critical rope, weakened by weeks of ice and strain, snapping at precisely the wrong moment. A steering oar, the vessel's entire means of directional control, suddenly compromised by damage that demanded immediate, improvised repair while the ship continued fighting through difficult seas regardless of whether repairs were finished. These moments demanded something particular from crews, not just physical skill, but a kind of composed clarity under genuine, immediate threat, the ability to think and act effectively despite fear that, in any reasonable assessment, would be entirely justified. Sailors who survived multiple voyages likely developed this capacity gradually, through repeated exposure to danger that never quite killed them. Each survived crisis building a kind of hard-won confidence in their own ability to function even when circumstances turned genuinely dire. Yet this confidence never fully erased the fear itself, only allowed men to function despite it. In quiet moments afterward, once immediate danger passed, crew members likely experienced something like delayed processing, hands shaking slightly once adrenaline faded, a kind of hollow, exhausted awareness of how narrowly disaster had been avoided. These moments rarely received extensive discussion. More often, they settled into a kind of shared, unspoken understanding, a memory each crew member carried individually while knowing, without needing confirmation, that everyone else aboard carried something similar. Some of these near disasters likely claimed partial victories even when full catastrophe was avoided, an injured hand from emergency rope work, a length of frostbite worsened by minutes spent exposed during crisis response, exhaustion deepened by the sheer physical and emotional toll of surviving genuine near-death experience. Survival, in these moments, rarely came without cost, even when that cost fell short of the worst possible outcome. These close calls, accumulated across a voyage's length, shaped something in how these men understood their own mortality, their own fragility against forces far larger than themselves. And this understanding, this hard-earned awareness of how thin the margin between survival and disaster actually was, connects directly to a question worth sitting with as we near this story's end. Why, despite everything, despite every danger we've traced across this voyage, did these men keep sailing, winter after winter, into risks they understood with total clarity? That question deserves real consideration, not a simple answer, because the truth behind it likely involved several forces working together, some practical, some deeply human, all worth understanding if we want to grasp what actually drove men back onto dangerous water year after year. Economic necessity sat at the foundation of much of this. Norse society, particularly in regions with limited arable land, depended heavily on trade and resource gathering that the sea made possible in ways farming alone couldn't match. For many families, a man's willingness to sail, regardless of season or risk, represented the difference between modest prosperity and genuine hardship. This wasn't abstract economic theory. It was the immediate, practical reality shaping decisions about whether a particular voyage, however dangerous, was worth undertaking. Beyond pure economics, though, something more complex operated within Norse social structure. Reputation carried weight that's difficult for modern audiences to fully appreciate, tied intimately to concepts of honor, reliability, and standing within a community that valued demonstrated courage and competence above almost anything else. A man known for his willingness to undertake difficult voyages, for his skill and endurance when conditions turned genuinely dangerous, accumulated a kind of social capital that extended far beyond simple wealth, shaping marriage prospects, alliances, and his family's broader standing within their community. This created a particular kind of pressure, though pressure feels perhaps too negative a word for something these men likely experienced, at least partially, as genuine aspiration rather than pure obligation. The sagas that survive from this era, while written later and shaped by their own narrative purposes, consistently celebrate courage and endurance in the face of genuine danger, suggesting these qualities held real cultural value, something young men likely aspired toward rather than simply endured out of necessity. There's also something worth considering about how repeated exposure to danger, survived successfully, shapes a person's relationship with risk itself. We touched on this in the previous chapter. Sailors who survived multiple close calls likely developed genuine confidence in their own capability, a sense, whether entirely justified or not, that their skill and experience gave them real advantage against dangers that might overwhelm less capable crews. This confidence, built through accumulated survival, may have made continued risk-taking feel considerably more reasonable to these men than it appears to us now, viewing their choices from a comfortable distance. Consider, too, the particular psychology of the sea itself, the way prolonged exposure to genuine danger and hardship can create something like attachment, however difficult that might be to fully understand from the outside. Men who spent significant portions of their lives at sea, who'd built their sense of competence and identity around their ability to face and survive maritime danger, likely found something meaningful in that identity, something that pure economic calculation doesn't fully explain. The sea, dangerous as it was, offered these men a stage for demonstrating exactly the qualities their culture valued most: courage, skill, endurance, and a particular kind of quiet stoicism in the face of genuine hardship. We shouldn't romanticize this too far, though. Fear was real. The dangers we've traced across this entire voyage were genuine, and sailors who died at sea, and many certainly did, represented real, devastating losses to their families and communities. This wasn't a culture that treated maritime death casually. Despite the risks these men chose to accept repeatedly, perhaps the most honest answer involves accepting that human motivation rarely reduces to a single, clean explanation. Economic necessity, cultural expectation, personal identity, accumulated confidence, and something harder to name, a kind of restless pull toward challenge and horizon that certain temperaments seem to carry regardless of era or culture. All of this likely combined, in varying proportions for different men, to produce crews willing to face what we've spent this entire story examining. What remains clear, regardless of the precise mixture of motivations, is this: these men understood, with a clarity that's almost startling given how casually we sometimes discuss historical risk-taking, exactly what they were facing each time they pushed a longship into winter water. They weren't naive. They weren't unaware of the danger. They simply judged, for reasons both practical and deeply personal, that this particular risk was one worth accepting again and again, voyage after voyage, until either successful return or genuine disaster determined which side of that calculation proved correct. And now, having traced this entire journey, from the ship's construction through every danger and hardship these men faced, we arrive at something worth sitting with quietly as this story draws toward its close, what it actually meant, in the end, to have survived something like this, and what that survival left behind in the men who lived to tell of it. We began this story in darkness, on open water, with men trying to close their eyes against cold that never fully left and a ship that never stopped moving beneath them. We end it, now, somewhere quieter, having traced every layer of what that survival actually demanded, the wood and wool that made the voyage possible, the fractured, stolen sleep, the silent endurance against frostbite and exhaustion, the storms and near disasters that tested every reserve these men carried. What strikes me most, looking back across everything we've explored tonight, isn't any single dramatic moment. It's the accumulation. The sheer, sustained weight of small hardships, repeated hour after hour. Day after day, week after week, until endurance itself became something closer to identity than simple action. These men didn't survive through any single heroic act. They survived through thousands of small decisions, made correctly, again and again, under conditions that offered little margin for error and even less comfort along the way. A steersman's careful hand. A crewmate's quiet offer of shared warmth. The discipline to layer wool correctly, to manage rope with numbed fingers, to find some fragment of rest even when true rest remained impossible. There's something worth carrying forward from this story, something beyond simple historical curiosity about how Vikings survived winter seas. It's a reminder, perhaps, of how much human endurance can actually absorb when circumstances demand it, how bodies and minds we might assume incapable of such sustained hardship somehow, repeatedly, found ways to keep functioning, keep working, keep choosing to continue rather than give in to what must have felt, at times, like entirely reasonable despair. And there's something, too, in the bonds these men forged through nothing gentler than shared suffering, that speaks to something enduring about human connection itself. We're built, it seems, to find each other most fully not in comfort, but in difficulty, and these crews, bound together by cold and danger and the particular intimacy of witnessed vulnerability, likely understood something about genuine connection that easier circumstances rarely teach with the same clarity. The ship they sailed no longer exists, not in any physical sense. The men themselves have been gone for 1,000 years, their individual names and faces lost to time in most cases, remembered now only through the broader story of what people like them accomplished and endured. But something of their experience remains accessible to us, if we're willing to sit with it carefully, the way we have tonight, a reminder that human beings, across vastly different eras and circumstances, share something essential in how we face genuine hardship, how we find, somewhere within ourselves, the capacity to keep going when stopping feels like the only reasonable choice, as you drift toward sleep now. Let yourself hold this image gently, a longship, somewhere far from any shore, moving steadily through dark winter water, its crew exhausted but enduring, bound together by something stronger than the cold trying to break them apart. They made it through nights like this one, more times than history bothered to record, through skill and stubbornness and the simple, quiet decision to keep facing whatever the sea offered next, somewhere out past memory, past the reach of written record. That ship is still sailing, in the way old stories always continue somewhere just beyond where we can quite see them. And perhaps that's enough to carry with you now, as your own night settles in around you. Not the danger, not the cold, but the quiet, hard-won knowledge that endurance, shared and sustained, can carry us through nights that feel, in the moment, entirely unsurvivable. Rest well.